Thanks, Simon. So, yeah, I'm Paul Maxwell. I know many of you, and it's good to at least see many of you. I haven't seen people like Francis for a long time, and it's back in the day I did work for Francis on the report card when I was a younger chap with more hair, as she pointed out before. So I've been working on the report card for about 20 odd years now. I don't work for Healthy Land and Water, who is the coordinator of the report card. I work for Alluvium Consulting, which is the logo you see on the bottom right there. I'm the research and development manager at Alluvium now, which means I get to play in a whole bunch of different spaces like the Murray-Darling and also on the Reef, as well as report cards for other regions. And I'm working on one at the moment as well, which is fantastic. So essentially, I'm almost talking about the 20 years of the report card today, and we'll talk about some lessons learned and a few other things. But I'm talking on behalf of Healthy Land and Water. They've got a new science manager there, Grace, and I'm not sure if she can join us today. But she's only been there for 3 weeks, so it's a bit unfair to ask her to present on the 20 years of Healthy Land and Water report carding in her 3rd week of employment. So why can't I change that? Of course. Okay, here we go. So I've been involved in the report card, as I said, for a large chunk of my career, on and off, essentially. It was the first job I ever got out of uni. I spent a year overseas and then applied for a job through a friend of mine, and actually a colleague of both Bill's and Simon's and Francis, if that matter, and got a 1-month job driving a boat as a 23-year-old in Moreton Bay. My first job was that left-hand picture there, which was to identify where corals were in Moreton Bay and then to design a monitoring program for those corals. That photo's from back in 2001. It was a particularly cold August day. I remember it very well. The only way we could decide on who got to go in the water was to do dibs. I ended up losing that dibs battle, and I spent three or four hours shivering in the water. I got back to the boat and I got told by that gentleman on the right-hand side there that the water was so clear that they ended up doing a coral survey from the boat itself. So they had no need at all for my data, but because I'd lost the dibs, it was my job to get in the water. So that's fair enough. The only other point I want to make about this particular photo is that right-hand, or this particular group of photos, is the right-hand photo there. That's Nicola Udy. Many of you might know her. She works for Parks and Wildlife on Moreton Bay Marine Park. We toured around in Moreton Bay together for many, many years, early in the 2000s, doing seagrass surveys. That particular day, I managed to run aground on a mudflat out at Crab Island, and right on top of the seagrass depth range site. So we buried a 2.5 tonne boat on our seagrass site, which wasn't a particularly good idea. We spent about 12 hours walking around that site, spent a lot of time talking about the system and understanding the system and trying to figure out what was going on. And I still use photos of that day to illustrate a few of the key points that I talk about in different seminars. So, that first job that I had straight out of uni was one of the best I've ever had, and probably will be the best job I've ever had. So I peaked straight out of university. It's all downhill until retirement for me. So the other point I want to make, and Francis made this point earlier, is that bottom left-hand photo. I only included that as because it reminded me that I did have hair at one point and didn't have a bald spot. So there's graphic evidence of that. So not about me though, it's about report cards today. These are the report cards laid out in 2013. They're from the first one all the way through to the 2013 report card on the right-hand side. We've had 7 since that photo was taken. And in my files, I pulled out one of the original, oh, you can't see that, there we go. One of the original, annual reports, Bill, from December 2000. Still pristine, hasn't been read, which is a bit concerning. And it has the first report card in it, in the back there, which you can't quite see, but nonetheless, it's the same as that first one on the left-hand side. So these things do stand the test of time, and it's a testament to their vision and the vision of those people who set it up, that it's lasted so long. So in this presentation, I want to talk a little bit about the history, how it was set up, the reason behind why the report card was set up. I want to talk about the original strategy, and I'm going to do a very quick qualitative evaluation of that strategy. And that's part of a presentation I gave at the International River Symposium last year, which was in Brisbane. And then I want to talk about some of the lessons that we've learned over the past 20 years. And I'm trying to keep them as generic as possible so they can form part of the basis of the discussions around the report card network in future seminars and future workshops. And I'm well and truly really keen on having the discussions around what those lessons would be and whether others have seen similar sorts of things in their report cards and what they've done to fix them or address them. All right, so a bit of background. This is southeast Queensland. You can see the Brisbane River running through the middle here. The city at the bottom part starts way up here in the Stanley River, and the upper Brisbane catchment runs through these two dams, Somerset Dam, Wivenhoe Dam, which my son this morning reckons he thinks it looks like a Chinese dragon, which is probably pretty accurate. Runs down through mid-Brisbane, extracts all our drinking water, and then out into the estuary, and then finally out into Moreton Bay, which is a big area out on the right-hand side here. And Moreton Bay is one of the absolute jewels of southeast Queensland, and it's a real shame that many of the community in southeast Queensland overlook Moreton Bay as a place to celebrate and visit. Unfortunately, it hasn't got as much notice as, say, the Gold Coast or the Sunshine Coast of places to visit. And that's a real shame because it's an incredible place to go and an incredible place to visit. So back in the day, the river was the absolute lifeblood of the city. So it was a recreational and transport hub. So, you know, back in 1897, from when this photo was taken at Bulimba, they used to discharge a lot of the cargo from the ships coming up from Sydney out at the port, or where the port is now, because the bar hadn't been cut at that particular point, or very close to this point, and then they'd ship it up with these little sailing dories up the river to the colony. Even by the 1920s, or in the 1920s, people used to use the river for swimming. So for those of you who know Brisbane, this is the Dutton Park, at Dutton Park. There's now a bridge that runs directly over that particular site that leads from Dutton Park over to UQ, the Eleanor Chanel Bridge. And if you've ever been at that area at low tide, you know that that intertidal zone is just thick mud, and I've got a photo of that in a sec. So swimming there is an incredibly unusual activity. You wouldn't think you'd be swimming there this day and age. But in the 1920s, they did do that. Even up into the 1930s and 40s, they used to swim in the tributaries of the river. So this is Norman Creek in 1937. It's a photo from a boys' school, the Church of England Grammar School, which exists in one of the pockets of Norman Creek. My old man went to this school, and he used to do this river swim. It was called the pocket swim. It was a mile around the pocket, and all the boys of the school would swim around the pocket. But they stopped doing that in the 1960s because people were getting sick. It became a liability to have students swimming in the river. I did a survey up there in 2009, I think it was, and saw a very, very large bull shark swimming on the surface. So I suspect that they probably pulled the students out there as well because of that particular physical risk, not just the health risk as well. Fishing was also a big part of the river. Obviously, a lot of people use the river as a lifeblood, directly a lifeblood, to feed their families. So a photo from 1950 to show a feed of jewfish that came out of Goodna in 1953. So by the 1990s, the late 1990s, particularly early 2000s, those particular values were long gone. The river had become an absolute problem for the city itself. At the very best, it was an eyesore for the community, but at the very worst, it was a public health problem, as I sort of mentioned around that Norman Creek problem. So a lot of people got together and said they need to do something about it. The first step was to identify the issues that occurred back then. So some of those things were like erosion, sediment erosion. So legacy of clearing up in the catchments led to gully erosion, channel erosion, hill slope erosion. That led to mobility of sediments that ended up in the Brisbane River itself. So this photo is from one of my first field trips back in 2001. It was February 2001, following about a 25 mil rainfall event. And you can just see how dirty that water is. That's up near Corona Downs at about 78 or almost 80 kilometres upstream of the Brisbane River mouth. So quite dirty up in the top part there. That then, all that sediment that is mobilised by those storms then gets deposited, or a lot of it gets deposited on the side of the river in this thick mud. So this is where I got my payback. This is the same chap who won the dibs and threw me in the cold water in Moreton Bay. He lost this particular dibs, and we threw him off the front of the boat to collect algal samples back in 2005. He landed in that very thick mud, and it took us a long time for us to get him out of that, mostly because we were laughing and taking photos of him. But nonetheless, that's actually pretty typical of all the intertidal areas of the mid to upper Brisbane River estuary. So this really thick mud that's been deposited for many, many years. That mud then gets mobilised and gets moved out into Moreton Bay. And this is a photo from the 2011 flood. And you can see out there on the right-hand side there is Moreton Island, Tangalooma over here. And you can just see how thick that mud is. So that's one problem. The second problem that we found, or that was a real problem back in the late 90s, early 2000s, was sewage treatment plants. So Luggage Point Sewage Treatment Plant, which is at the mouth of the Brisbane River, was discharging around about 160 megalitres of sewage a day. At that time, it was particularly poorly treated, hadn't been upgraded yet. That caused algal problems, which in turn caused fish kills. So a big problem with the community. When fish start dying, people start noticing. So that was a really big issue back then. At the same time, we were starting to get extensive habitat loss. So around 2000, there was extensive loss of mangroves and salt marsh on the right-hand side, largely due to coastal development. And on the left-hand side, that left-hand panel there, significant loss of seagrass. So I've outlined 2 boxes there. That'll come back to roost later in my presentation. But you can see the big pink blotch in the southern Deception Bay, this top one here. That was lost in 1996 following a flood in the Caboolture River. This area here, we hadn't lost any seagrass since 1987 because most of it was lost in the 1940s and 50s. We haven't seen seagrass in that part of the river, or that part of the bay, sorry, since the 1940s and 50s. So significant habitat loss, which coincided with all those issues around water quality. So in recognition of the fact that no one organisation had ownership over this problem, nor had ownership over the solution, a partnership was formed, and that was the Healthy Waterways Partnership back in the day, which Bill, who's on the line, had a significant part in playing, as well as others who are also on the line. So it's good to see other people coming back again to the Report Card Network. The only thing I wanted to highlight on this particular slide, plenty of local councils got involved, state government departments got involved, the utilities like SEQ Water wasn't around, particularly around the early 2000s, but now the drinking water utilities involved. The sewage treatment plant utilities, and of course the universities, Uni of Queensland, Griffith University, Uni of the Sunshine Coast at the moment, as well as QUT. But also industry was involved as well. So Amcor carton boards, Incitec Pivot and AMH back in the day, and they had discharges going into different estuaries that led into Moreton Bay. So they had a requirement to be part of a receiving environment monitoring program and bought into the Healthy Land and Water, or Healthy Waterways Partnership at the time. The first thing that the partnership did before coming up with the report card idea was to bring together all of the science and information that was known about Moreton Bay, and that was in the Moreton Bay study book. Many of you may have seen that that particular book or read it. I've got a copy here, if you can see that. If you are it is from the library. At some point, I will take it back to the library, potentially. They're still available. They're available online. I think Bill's got it on his website at the University of Maryland. So jump online and have a look if you're interested. I still use it as a baseline condition assessment. It's got some fantastic information in there. So they pulled that all together in one really neat study. But what they really did that was incredibly clever for the time, particularly, was this conceptual model. So we use conceptual models all the time now. They're not particularly exciting, but it was a really neat way of bringing together all the issues that confronted Moreton Bay and to be able to articulate them to politicians. So you can articulate that problem very quickly and everyone agreed upon it, everyone could see it, and you could talk about the solutions. That then led to a strategy which I want to talk about evaluating in the middle part of the presentation. It was called the South East Queensland Regional Water Quality Management Strategy, released in September 2001, which ultimately led to $1 billion spent on sewage treatment plant upgrades and a significant improvement in water quality as a result. And I'll show you some graphs from that period as well. So that strategy was what kicked everything off, essentially. The report card included and the monitoring program that sat under it. The vision was for 2020. So it was a fantastic document that outlined a vision for 2020. Back then, it probably seemed like a very, very long way off. So you couldn't really expect anything to happen in the short term. You could, in 2020, we want all these things to happen. We're there now. So I think it's a really good time to look back on that strategy and ask, was it successful? Or what were the successful elements of it? And what were the things that we could have done differently and should do differently in the future? So the vision for 2020 was that statement on the screen now. I'll read it out very quickly. So by 2020, the SEQ's catchments and waterways will be healthy living ecosystems supporting the livelihoods and lifestyles of people in Southeast Queensland, and will be managed through the collaboration between community, government and industry. The major drivers were all those things that I've just mentioned. So declining water quality in the estuaries and in the catchments themselves, as well as loss of seagrass, algal blooms and threats to fisheries in Moreton Bay. So substantial drivers that were the forerunner, if you like, for this particular strategy. The strategy was a very large document in multiple different volumes that outlined a whole bunch of different actions. I'm not going to go through each one, you'll be happy to know. But they did split them up into 3 main time periods for the life of the strategy. And this is important because it comes back to a point I want to make towards the end about staying the course with these big strategies. And then something that we don't always do. So they broke them up into 1998 to 2003, 2004 to 2007, and then 2008 to 2020. The first part was very much around SDP upgrades. Middle part was about planning and stormwater control. And then the right-hand side was really focusing on diffuse urban and rural loads coming out of the catchments. So did this strategy have the intended consequences? It was a fantastic roadmap for action going towards 2020. But the problem was, I think we lost sight in that middle part between 2004 and 2007. Something happened, and I'll get back to that later on. But what I want to do in the next 4 or 5 slides is just to show you some of the benefits or some of the things that improved as a direct result of the actions that were contained within the strategy. So I'll start with some good news. Water quality has substantially improved in Southeast Queensland as a result of that strategy, and that has been borne out in the report card over the whole 20-year period. Just to highlight that fact, this is the Brisbane River nutrient component. You've got total nitrogen on the left-hand side here, total phosphorus on the right-hand side, the Brisbane River mouth at 0 kilometres upstream, the top of the estuary at 90 kilometres upstream. This is just about the estuarine component. And in 2000, there was a substantial sewage treatment plant that discharges in the middle part of the Brisbane River, the Oxley. So it's the second biggest sewage treatment plant in Queensland. That was upgraded in around about 2005. And you can see a substantial improvement as a result of that in water quality between 2000 and 2013. Still not meeting the guidelines or compliant with the water quality guidelines, but a huge improvement in nutrients. So it did its job, if you like. That's pretty much the story that we've seen throughout Southeast Queensland estuaries. All the estuaries that have had sewage treatment plants in them, and they've all been upgraded, we've seen substantial improvements in water quality as a result of those upgrades over the 20 years of the report card and monitoring program. To show that, this is some of Simon's old PhD work when he was a fresh-faced youngster and didn't have a bald spot. I'm not sure if you have a bald spot now, Simon. No, you don't. No. Sucks to be you. So this is 1998. Essentially what this graph shows is the extent of sewage plume, the sewage plume that goes out into Moreton Bay. It was a really unique method that identified where the sewage nitrogen that comes out of the estuary. So effectively the processed nitrogen, how far out into Moreton Bay that impacted. In 1998, it was a big impact, particularly around that Luggage Point sewage treatment plant area. By 2001, that Luggage Point STP had been upgraded and that impact wasn't quite as dramatic. By 2003, it was really only, the sewage plume was only really around Bramble Bay, where the STPs in the North Pine River, as well as Cabbage Tree Creek, hadn't been upgraded yet. They were upgraded in 2004, 2005. And then finally, by 2013, all the STPs had been upgraded and we couldn't find a sewage signal out in Moreton Bay at all, which is fantastic news. And that sort of bears out with the data that I showed you before. So on top of that, we started to see seagrass returning to the Western Bay. So these two squares, which are the squares that I showed you way back at the beginning there, are areas that we've seen seagrass recovery in Moreton Bay. So in 2012, I was doing my PhD and trying very hard not to do my PhD on a Friday afternoon. I was tooling around on near maps looking at aerial imagery, which why I wasn't watching YouTube videos like every other PhD student, I don't know. But anyway, I was looking at aerial footage and we could start to see little patches of seagrass in and around Scarborough Boat Harbour. Seagrass wasn't supposed to be there. It hadn't been there since 1996. It wasn't supposed to be there. So we went out the next week, Alistair Grinham and I from UQ, had a look out there, and lo and behold, there was a little meadow of seagrass out here. Now, we've been tracking that meadow for 10 years now. I'm happy to say that it's recovered all the way to the Caboolture River mouth, almost to the extent of the seagrass prior to the loss in 1996. It's an amazing meadow. Plenty of fish. I'll show you some footage in a second. Plenty of fish, lots of turtles. A couple of dugongs have been spotted there as well. And it's also held up to the 2011 flood and the 2013 flood. So we've got high hopes that it's a little bit more persistent than it has been in the past. So fingers crossed. More importantly, or probably more excitingly, is this Bramble Bay seagrass here. We haven't seen seagrass there since the 1940s. We were asked to do a survey by a company that wanted to put an inflatable fun park here at Clontarf. They asked us if there was seagrass there, and I very confidently said, no seagrass at all. We'll go and have a look. Jumped over the side of the boat, had a look, and there's small patches of grass. In the preceding years, so from 2017 to 2019, you can just see how big that seagrass meadow is now and has extended out to around Redcliffe, which is fantastic news also. And just want to show you a quick video of that. This is right at the bottom end of the seagrass. You can see the meadow way up here. So we try to monitor fish both inside and outside the seagrass meadows, particularly those that are growing. And you can see, as soon as you see any kind of seagrass, you get fish. And these whiting patrol the edge of the seagrass meadow, and they're a fantastic commercial and recreational species for southeast Queensland. So that's all good news, and we should all very much celebrate that. But it's not all good news. I don't want to leave you with the impression that everything's been solved, because clearly it hasn't. The problem with this strategy is that something happened, as I mentioned before, in that middle period, in that period between 2004 and 2007. So to highlight that, what I've done is to go through each of the strategies, each of the actions that were highlighted in that particular strategy, and colour them different colours. So green are the ones that were done, orange are the ones that were started but probably didn't finish, and then red were the ones that we didn't get to at all. So you can see in the middle there, something happened between 2004 and 2020, where we stopped talking about this strategy almost entirely, and we certainly didn't revisit it in any of the actions within it, and we certainly didn't evaluate it. So three things that I think were happening in that particular period. First one is that the easy stuff had been done. So STPs are engineering simplicity. You know where they are, you know where the problem is, they've got a legislated requirement to upgrade them, they've got license discharge requirements, and there's money to spend on them. It sounds a lot easier. I know back in 2000 and late 1999, it was very hard to do that, but relatively compared to diffuse load problems, it's much, much easier. So diffuse loads require a lot of engagement with thousands, literally thousands and thousands of landholders. Each of them own a very, very small part of the problem, and many of them don't know that their very small part of the problem contributes to a greater problem down in Moreton Bay. So the issue then becomes more about engagement and convincing people rather than an engineering solution like it was in the late 90s and early 2000s. The second issue, I think, in that mid part was that the champions had moved on. So people like Bill, who started this, got this going, the political champions, the Jim Sawleys of the world, they'd all moved on. So it was very hard for those coming behind to convince the political masters that they needed to stay the course on this strategy. The other thing that I think was happening is that the honeymoon was over. So in the early part, in the sort of 2000, 2003 era, everyone was very excited. It was very new. It was very shiny. The report card was getting great coverage in the media. By 2004, the report card had been seen before, and we were telling the same story. Ipswich and the Bremer River were getting an F. Bramble Bay was getting an F. Nothing was being done. They weren't seeing any improvement. So people wanted to see the next thing, the new things. So what we did, and I can never explain this, is that we wrote two strategies as a region, two additional strategies in 2007 and in 2014. What we should have done, I think, was to revisit this strategy and redone it in the best possible way. So revisited the strategy and reinvigorated it, reevaluated the monitoring and report card program to update it and improve it as we went along this particular strategy. We didn't do that. All right, so the last part of the presentation, I want to talk about the lessons learned from that 20-year period, and I'll put it with a couple of caveats around this. These are my thoughts only. It's only my opinion. I'm more than happy to hear discussion about them. In fact, I'd really love to hear discussions about them and to see what other people's experiences are around the country and internationally. So this is essentially the reason why the Report Card Network was set up 5 or 6 years ago now. I can't remember exactly when it was to discuss these issues that we're finding with the report cards and understand how others have solved them and how they approach them. So let me go through at least 5. I've got 5 generic issues that I've seen over the 20-odd years that I've been involved in the South East Queensland report cards. Number 1 is beware the expansion. So we expanded the program in 2014. In no way am I suggesting that that program shouldn't be changed and program shouldn't be expanded. But one of the issues I wanted to highlight was that expansions require effort and resources, and you've got to figure out what the priorities are as well. So just because there's a desire there to expand and monitor and measure different values doesn't necessarily mean they're the highest priority things that you need to do. So it really does require going back to the start, understanding what their main priorities are for the region before just expanding a monitoring program. Nonetheless, this is what we did. All of our members in Healthy Land and Water wanted us to expand the program. There was 2 different reports written to show us how to do that. and we did that in 2014. Having said all of that, the expansions that we did make, I think, are incredibly important and incredibly useful to the discussion around water quality and catchment management in southeast Queensland, as well as the management of Moreton Bay. So we went from just these things you see on the screen here, so mostly water quality. One of the biggest criticisms of the report card and the monitoring program in the late 2000s, so 2010 and onwards, was around that it was only water quality focused. So we introduced a social and economic benefit assessment. So we monitor that every year, looking at drinking water supply and the agricultural value, recreational value of catchments and waterways, and the satisfaction of the community with their waterways. Also look at the actions and the barriers to actions as well. So monitoring how much people actually do for waterway investment and improvement in southeast Queensland. Looking at the barriers, things like social values that different catchments have for their waterways, as well as the water literacy of the community. So understanding what the problems are. And then also linking that all back to pressures. So that's all well and good. A fantastic program revamp. It was well received, has been well received. But essentially what we did a poll of our members last year. They were reducing their memberships funds because all the councils are, becoming skint, and they've got to justify why they're paying into the particular program. We polled which of the parts of the monitoring program report card they wanted to keep. And they said everything was valuable, but the stuff they absolutely needed was the stuff that their compliance requirements needed them to do. So way back at the start, where we talked about the receiving environment reporting programs, essentially that's the stuff they wanted us to focus on. So this is the stuff they need to do for compliance. Now that's a terrible indictment on the human condition. Rather than doing things that are of interest and that you can, actually have a positive improvement, we're only really focusing on compliance. But at the fundamental baseline, that's one of the reasons why a lot of people bought into the program initially, was because of that compliance requirement. So what we probably should have done back in 2014 was to refocus the program to make sure that it covered off on that compliance requirement and then expanded from there, rather than just go on to the expansion that we did. So that was probably lesson number one. Lesson number two would be that I would encourage a strong separation between the report card from the monitoring program. So separate the two. The monitoring program is a very hard and fast focus on data collection and understanding system condition. The report card should be a real focus on communicating and evaluating and providing an inspiration to the community for action. So separate those two things out. The reason why I say that is because report card fatigue is very real, and many of you know that from experience. You've been involved in report cards for many different years, just like we have in southeast Queensland. But people get fatigued about the report card results very quickly. But by their very nature, the report card measures are inflexible and they're rigid. They need to be, because you want that long-term data set so you can assess it over time. But there is a requirement for flexibility, because people really want to focus on new and shiny things, as I talked about before, but that's where you can do it in the monitoring program. So the monitoring program can be flexible, it can be adaptable, it can have a contingency element to it where it can pick up events like floods, droughts, contingency monitoring that can be started and finished. That's where the flexibility can start. You can add in different indicators and subtract different indicators and keep your report card fairly static over time. So really, it really comes down to separating those two things and articulating that to members and to investors, that there is a lot of data sitting under the report card. It's not just about communicating in the report card. Number three is that report cards are inherently a negative tool. The problem I think we found in southeast Queensland is that we're fundamentally reinforcing a negative opinion about the problem areas in SEQ. So I'll explain what I mean by that. This is a graph of the report card grades from, I think, 2018. It doesn't matter how you spin it. Ultimately, you're going to give some areas, and you can see some catchments here are getting A's and some catchments are getting D's. In this particular year, no one got an F. So fundamentally, the ones that get poor grades are the ones that you're trying to inspire. And negative messages, we've found over 20 years of report carding in SEQ, don't inspire anyone. In actual fact, it turns them off. it's disengaging for the community, and that's the community who you want to do most of the improvements, particularly in those diffuse sources that I was talking about right back at the start. So to illustrate that point, one of the Ipswich City Councillors back in 2018, actually this year, said to me that they didn't want to come to the report card launch, and I asked them why. His response was, because the physical action of a scientist handing us the report card is seen by the community as us accepting responsibility for all the problems in our catchment. So we're a small council, we can't do everything. We require a partnership approach to solving these problems. So we don't want to come to be blamed. And it was a real eye-opener for me that whether or not it's true or not, whether they're the ones who are responsible, they didn't want to be targeted with the negative connotations of their grade. They wanted a more positive response to get everybody on board to help solve the issue. So that's point number one. The other one is that environmental grades, negative environmental grades or low environmental grades, detach people from their system, from engaging with their system. So let me show you some data, because I'm a scientist, I like to show data. I'll get to that point towards the end. So this is a graph of environmental score on the y-axis. So essentially what sits beneath the grades from 0 to 1, 0 being bad, 1 being very, very good. And this is a result from our social survey. Again, 0 being bad, 1 being good. And it's a combination of how people responded that they wanted to visit, or what was their likelihood of visiting their local waterways, that is their waterways close to their home. And you can see that condition, so environmental condition, is pretty strongly related to their satisfaction with using their waterways, their likelihood of using their waterways. The ones that are in very good condition, people tend to like to use them. The ones that are in poor condition, people tend to use them. But there's a couple of points I want to make about this particular graph. There are areas in southeast Queensland which are in fairly good condition, Caboolture being one of them, where the community is absolutely disengaged. They don't want to use their waterways. They don't do anything about their waterways. They think they're in poor condition, yet they're actually in pretty good condition. So by us giving them poor scores for many different years, you're actually fundamentally just reinforcing that negative value. So if you tell people their system has no value, they stop valuing it. So we need very positive tools to be able to highlight that even in poor condition catchments, there is positive value there. So let me highlight that point before I move on to my last issue. This is a video that I showed the Council of Mayors. Now, I was at a total loss of things to talk about with the Council of Mayors, so I decided to throw a video in there. This is a result, or just a video from our fish data, and it just shows a turtle in the Tingalpa Creek. Now, Tingalpa Creek's not particularly good, it's not particularly bad. This is 3 kilometres up that creek. Now, the only time in the entire conversation I had with 9 or so different mayors around southeast Queensland, this is the only time they put their head up from their phones, was when we showed them a video. They started asking questions about fish, they started asking questions about turtles. All I probably needed to do was show them one video about the fish in their local system, and they would have been more interested. So that's what we started to do in the years after this particular video was shown, was just try and highlight that even places like the Brisbane River, the fish, there's a lot of fish there. I mean, it's not perfect by any stretch, but there is strong values that people can engage with, and I think that's a critical one. All right, so fourth point, innovation distracts from purpose. I know that's particularly maybe a little bit controversial, but I just want to highlight this point. This is how we used to do water quality samples, and we went into water quality buoys, and now we've got robotic boats that collect water quality samples. So that's fantastic. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that innovation is not a good idea, but I think it distracts a lot from the purpose. And if you think about all the effort and money and time that goes into developing these technologies, you've got to ask the question of, would that time be better spent doing something on the ground that improves the water quality rather than just improves the way we monitor it? So business development suffers from innovation, absolutely, but I think environmental protection and conservation suffers from just a simple lack of activity. Getting there and implementing actions that we knew about back in the 80s and 90s is what we need here. So we need to be able to convince people to do things rather than, finding technology and new ways of monitoring the problem. Okay, finally, and the last point you'll be happy to know that I'm making is that 20 years of report carding is that it's very clear to me that scientists aren't marketers. The report card tool back in 1999 and 2000 was a fantastic communication tool, and it was really good. I think we're at the point now, though, where we need to start looking at getting the marketers involved, the people who understand psychology, at least the psychologists, because they understand how to convince people to do things differently. As scientists, we tend to think that if we provide people with the facts, that they're likely to go, oh, I understand. I want to do something. I'm going to do something about that. I'm going to go out and plant some trees. We know now that that's not true. And let me highlight that point before I finish and open it up for questions. One of our social surveys back in 2017, I think, we asked people what were their biggest issues with their local waterway. What were the concerns? Litter came out on top. So all the respondents, this is the priorities. They said litter at the very top, climate change, water pollution, blah, 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 all the way down to soil erosion at the bottom. So if you're a scientist in the Healthy Land and Water Scientific Expert Panel, you would say that soil erosion is one of the biggest issues. Yet the community doesn't really care about soil erosion. They don't really think it's a big problem. Yet we keep talking about soil erosion, so that doesn't engage anybody. When you split it out into different groups, if you split it out into the people who said they have no environmental concern, and we monitored this with a whole range of different questions, litter still came out on top. Then it was followed by water supply, water pollution, and flood impact. So the physical elements that would impact on someone's life. On the right-hand side, those that talked about, or who had higher environmental concern, litter was still the problem. Yet in our monitoring program and in our report card, we very rarely mention litter. So I'm not suggesting that litter is indeed the biggest problem of waterways in Southeast Queensland, but it certainly is in the forefront of people's minds. So how do we tap into that psychology and say, I want to account for the concerns that you've got, and then pivot towards the issues that we're actually finding, that are impacting on catchment condition in our catchments in SEQ. So with that, I wanted to pause there or stop there and open it up for questions.